Welcome to the third annual Eastern Sierra Wildfire Resilience Month. Our webinar tonight is Lessons Learned from Los Angeles Wildfires with our guest speaker, Yana Valachovic. My name is Crystal, and I work with Whitebark Institute. We are a local nonprofit consisting of passionate individuals who deeply care about cultivating resilient landscapes and communities. By collaborating with partnering agencies, local tribes, we discover the concerns and the needs of our communities across the Eastern Sierra. Based on the best science available, we do environmental assessments, we develop and implement fuel reduction treatment plans, and we provide educational resources about landscape health, wildfire prevention, and home preparedness. This is part of our series of Wildfire Resilience Month events. These events are made possible by generous funding from Edison International and CAL FIRE, the commitment from our partners, Mono and Inyo counties, and the amazing number of participating organizations and agencies that have come together this year to plan these impactful events. Wildfire Resilience Month events are designed not only to raise awareness about current wildfire challenges, highlight regional resilience efforts, and emphasize ways to prevent accidental ignitions. We really aim to promote that community engagement and give residents actionable strategies and resources that they can use to prepare for wildfire. But we are beyond grateful that Yana has joined us again tonight for this year. This is her third year in a row joining us for wildfire resilience events. Yana Valachovic is the County Director and Forest Advisor for the University of California Cooperative Extension in Humboldt and Del Norte counties. Well known for her work in wildfire mitigation and community resilience, we are so grateful that you continue to share your knowledge and expertise with our communities. I will stop sharing and hand it over to you, Yana. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for the invitation. I've been in Inyo and Mono counties a number of times over the last maybe 5 years or so. I'm not quite sure. So I have you all are in my heart in a special place, and I love your great people, your energy, your enthusiasm, and all the work that Crystal and Kristen and Wendy and all the folks are doing in collective action to try and really help bring good information, knowledge, and empower you all to be fantastic stewards in this fire space. So I'm going to share some thoughts tonight. I work in the research space trying to understand basically how we can find kind of the key gems out of tragedy. It's a bit of kind of morbid work at some level, and I want you to know that if any of you have lost a home or know people that lost a home, I'm going to talk about some things in a very analytical way. That doesn't mean that I don't care, and it doesn't mean that my heart doesn't go out to people that have experienced this kind of impact. I am a bit hardened to it, having done it a number of times, and I hope that through looking carefully at post-fire events, we can gain some key ideas and bring those home to our communities to help inspire us to prevent these kinds of events from happening in our own home environment. So I've been to LA a couple of times in January and February, really trying to look at situations like this one. Is my video screwing up? I see that. Can you all? Oh, interesting. Can you hear me at least?
Yes.
Your voice is coming through well, but yeah, your video is glitching.
Okay, well, I don't know if I'll be able to fix that easily. So if I have to go off camera, my apologies, and please say something, Crystal, or let me know if that happens again. I just thought doing something Friday. So anyway, so I go and I work with teams and other folks to try and understand, was there something different between the house on the left or the house on the right? And did the house on the right have some secret sauce that we might be able to learn from? And what might have been the key factors that influenced the house on the left and its inability to resist wildfire? So let me just give me a second to move that bar. Okay. And so what tonight I'm going to talk about are some of the general factors that contribute to home loss. I want to talk a bit about priorities for the year And if we get enough time, I'll mention some thoughts around building new and maintenance. And um, we'll just kind of see where it goes. I'm open to questions, and Crystal, I trust your instincts in this space. And so I've got to pause space a little way into it and see where we're at. I want to make sure that we've got interaction and keeps it real and keeps it interesting for you all. And I want to frame it around LA because LA is recent, and is there something unique or different about LA that can contribute to our thinking here, and then bring it home. So I just want to start with that opening question.
He's not muted either.
It's Wildfire Preparedness Month, and let's take a moment and just reflect quietly about how are you preparing. I want to acknowledge and give you big props for showing up today, right? That's a huge step in taking time out of your busy lives to spend some time with us and think some more around what actions might be important in your preparation for this season. So, what is on your list? Have you thought about some home mitigations? Have you signed up for the alerts? Are you developing a set of photos around things that you've done that are changing on your property that you can help communicate to the insurance companies around how you are mitigating some of the risk? Are you working with your neighbors in your community? Have you joined a Firewise community? These are all things that you might be on your list. So I look forward to hearing more about that in a minute. I'm going to start with a video. This is from a fire in Northern California in 2018. It's in a agricultural setting, so there's some cultivated trees as well as a bunch of grasslands. And I just want to open by thinking about ember exposure and how fire behaves. And I know you guys just had a fire not too far away from Bishop. So let's just see what you all think about this. There's no audio to it. I can't tell you how this originated, but you can see that there are some dry grasslands and there's some wind pushing that, not too much yet. There's some spot fires that start to show up. And then in a minute, there's going to be a spot fire right in front of the photographer right there, showing, how unpredictable wildfire can be as it starts to progress. But what I find really interesting to me is when we start to get into near to the homes and we can look around and see all of the items that might be constituted as fuel. There's a garbage can there on the right-hand side. There's some stored firewood and some other things. There goes our friend deer. And then here we are underneath some really green trees. And we can see the embers starting to push through those trees, more embers being created from the fallen leaves. And it just, for me, gives me a sense of how stochastic it is, how many different things are happening simultaneously in a fire event. And then sort of what is fuel on the property and how do we think about that fuel and whether or not we've got capacity for our fire engines to be able to move around and get at where the fire may be. As you can see, that fire truck trying to work through it. So, a complicated environment with a lot of things at play. So, using that to kind of level set where and how a fire might behave in our environment. And are we ready to get out of harm's way before that occurs? And can we prepare ourselves to evacuate quickly given that kind of dynamic? So, as I said in the front end, my research space is really trying to understand this issue of building loss. And these are fresh images from Altadena. And, I think it's sort of indiscriminate. Like, why are these two houses in the middle of this row still surviving? Or why did they succumb where the rest of them didn't really have much exposure? And, you can also see that in the foreground, that there were some native chaparral that had burned, and there's roadways, and it just looks like suburbia. And I think that's what catches a lot of folks off guard in this, is that these type of events can happen really in our most built up environments. They're not just in the wildland setting. So, as I said, my work is trying to figure out what's the difference between these types of buildings. So for context, let me just kind of level set here in that, and the statistics are changing pretty dramatically now, that in the last 10 years, 14 million acres of California have burned. It's taken way too many lives and way too many structures in that time period. And I think we're only now beginning to think about the staggering effect of, I think, what is it, 18,000 structures out of the LA basin, and then how many have intense smoke damage, and some of those may not be recoverable. So the shadow effect of wildfire is really significant. And within that is this whole issue associated with embers, which are some of what I just showed you in that previous video, but this movement of firebrands, which come from vegetation or come from the built environment, and those are moved in the air column, and they find weaknesses in our structures, which is what happened here on the Palisades Fire when it burned to the beach here. So I want to start us off with some language and some vocabulary here, starting from the left-hand column, this idea that fire comes from somewhere else and it comes through some vegetation type. And that can be grassland, it can be shrubs, it can be woodlands, and it could be, in this case, it looks like a conifer tree. But the idea has been that fire comes from somewhere else and it drives directly to the structure. And we have something called direct flame contact, also called flame impingement. And, how might we mitigate that? Well, over the years, we've talked a lot about defensible space work, which is really fuel modification to interrupt the transmission of fire towards the structure and make it such that we might not have a pathway, or if we do, that the flames and the vegetation are such that the flame height is reduced significantly and crews can safely stage to try and defend the structure. Meaning the flame height is 4 feet or less. That's about when people can actually be successful against cutting line and the movement of fire. You can also work up to about 8 feet with dozers and other types of mechanized equipment. After that, everything is the indirect method, and it's a lot harder. So flame contact, I think, what we've talked about forever and ever and ever. But this issue of embers and radiant heat is in some ways kind of moving into our cultural awareness. And I think embers probably are better understood now. So they're moving through the air column. They can land on, in, or adjacent to the structure. And they are able to ignite things that are combustible in those different locations. And they can exploit and enter through vents, open windows, dog and kitty doors, a garage door that doesn't seal very well. And you can kind of see where that progresses. And as a result, you end up with ignition inside the structure, or you end up with flames right touching the outside of the structure. So our form of response to these, how do we armor ourselves, is really through hardening the structure, which we can talk more about in a minute, and then removing those combustibles and those flammables that are just adjacent to that structure. Because, in many ways, we've been putting kindling all around our buildings and then hoping that, that doesn't have any interaction with fire, and it's just not true. So the third vocabulary term that I want to bring forward is this concept of radiant heat. And radiant heat is this idea where you get heat transfer through the air that's significant enough to cause some type of impact to another, in this case, a house. And what that impact is can vary, and it can be the deformation of the window frame that leads to the panel of the window glass falling out. It can be enough heat that breaks the window glass. It can be enough heat that ignites combustible siding. All of that can vary, but the point being that all the structures on the property become and develop the potential to interact with the other structures. And so even in this case, where it might be just some kind of funky shed and maybe doesn't have things of significant value, if it succumbs to fire, that the stepwise progression from that shed towards the primary building creates vulnerability. So if I'm to offer you one thing to take home tonight, it's really to look at all of the flammable material and think about the potential radiant heat that those different elements might pose. So how do we manage that? Again, through home hardening, where we can kind of shore up those weaker elements of the building. and then doing some fuel reduction so we don't end up with a high radiant heat load from surrounding vegetation. So, all right, you guys all with me on those terms? So I'm going to use those in various different combinations as I speak today. So we saw this image earlier on one of the flyers, and I love this image for lots of reasons because it kind of puts you in the detective mode. And I'd like you to think about which direction is the wind blowing? And what evidence might you use to understand which direction the wind is blowing? We can see some swirling here on the left, horizontally, swirling over here behind this firefighter on the right. And the answer is that it has to do with this bright yellow white stuff right here. So I'm going to tell you that that's fire. And why I'm fixated on that part is because the air and the embers are moving from left to right, and they crash into this wall, and then the embers fall to the base. And so all of a sudden we have this collection of hot coals, in essence, right at the edge of the structure. And because in this situation, there's a lot of cultivated landscaping as well as some mulch that's trying to help keep the water, the water transmission down. That is a very flammable set of materials. And all of a sudden we have now direct flame contact on the structure. So the fluid dynamics are interesting. And if you're to try and understand this in your own place, if you've ever been sitting out on the front porch or the back deck and you've seen the leaves swirl and get these little eddies of, swirling, that's where you're likely to see embers go. They're going to follow those same air patterns, which are a bit of a product of the wind direction as well as the shape of the building. I'll leave it at that, and just to say that, embers are going to find combustible materials, and we have a pattern of basically putting a lot of them around our properties just to kind of create the aesthetic that we think is so great, but that aesthetic is also creating some issues. So how I might redesign this is really to flow the sidewalk out and then create a garden or planting bed in the center here, which can create that focal point. But then you've got this hardening both horizontally and perhaps a little bit vertically, so that when embers are brought to this property in the future, that they're not going to find anything combustible. So certainly easier to do on the front end when you're building than it is to retrofit. But I think you get the idea of how these, the way we've been landscaping are essentially creating some issues for us. So my work is backed up by observations in the field, mostly in post-fire settings, but also in collaboration with the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. And they have a lab in South Carolina that is really quite large. Here's a building within it, and they have wind turbines that sit behind these ember generators, and they can adjust the velocity, the gusts, and a number of items. And so here, I think it gives you a nice idea of how the physics of that fluid movement of those embers can play. So here, the embers are thrown against the building. They drop to the base. You see that bright line, that point of ignition. You can see how they spread out and how they wrap around the corner. You can see how they bump up over the top. And I'm going to show a graphic that probably many of you have seen already. I'm going to hold it for a minute and then just say, spoiler alert, the building on the left is going to burn, the building on the right isn't, but let's figure out why. So this building, which is a duplex, has wood siding on the left, fiber cement siding on the right, has wood mulch on the left, and it has rock mulch on the right. And it has 2 wood decks. What I'd like you to do is pay attention to the wood decks, because that's probably the simplest to understand, because that creates the point of only one singular change. And the question I have for you is, how long does it take for the wood deck to ignite? And does it ignite on the right when you have rock mulch? So as this plays out, which is only a minute, you'll see that this building, which you can see the embers coming, looks a little bit like snow. We get ignition really quickly in that wood mulch. And then within a few seconds, you get it underneath the deck. and it starts to penetrate underneath the deck. On the right-hand side, still no ignition, 20 seconds out. But once you get a good surface fire going, it starts to run and curve around that corner, and then it starts to run up the combustible siding on the left-hand side. We've got in 30 seconds, pretty good ignition underneath that deck. You can see a lot of smoke and flames starting to stick out. On the right-hand side, no ignition. Here we are at 45 seconds, full under eave engagement and starting to push in to the gable and vent. And this whole process happens really quickly. So this is a laboratory experiment. It's not 100% real life. In your own environment, this mulch could be wetter or drier, and it might take less time or more time. But as you reflect on this, the question I have for you is, how long does it take to get fire personnel to your place? Is it within a minute? That would be a miracle. Most cases, response times at the soonest are about 10 minutes. And if we've surrounded our structures with kindling, in 10 minutes, we're going to have a fully engaged and engulfed building. What I find interesting is when you look on the right-hand side, within that exposure time, because of the non-combustible area that this deck sat on, we didn't get any engagement in that deck at all. So that's a really positive attribute to show that once you can remove the combustibles around our wood attachments like decks and maybe stairs, that we can really prevent that process of ignition of those. So fire generally starts at the surface before it climbs. And so if the surface doesn't ignite, then it's hard for fire to climb. And we rarely see independent ignition at a more elevated location. So you don't see independent crown fire, for example. Now, I'm going to talk more about LA soon. I just wanted to kind of level set us on some information. I did a research project in Paradise, not your Paradise, but this is in Butte County with a campfire in 2018. And a couple visual images here. The homes that are consumed are the ones in ash here and here. If you just look at the image on the left, can you tell me where the green trees are? Are they near to the buildings? Are they near to the roads? Where do you see them? Is there any pattern to what you see? For me, I noticed that the green trees, especially in this block, are away from the homes, or here a little farther away from the homes. And most of the damage to the trees is near to the homes. And that makes some sense when you think about how cured all the wood is in our buildings. And that if you think about it in that way, like they're really the most combustible part of the landscape. And once you get ignition in those buildings, then you can have neighbor to neighbor spread because of all that radiant heat. And then because you can get construction embers or embers that are coming from our buildings, and those start to move in the air column. So there's kind of like a contagion effect, if you will. And in fact, when we dug in deep, what we found was that 73% of the homes were within 18 meters or about 54 feet of a destroyed structure. So the survival or loss of the neighboring structure had a lot to do with survivorship or loss of the structure of interest. And so that's not to be a defeated message, but it is to say that there's some shared work in this, and there's some shared opportunity for us to really elevate each other and understand the value of elevating each other. And this, just looking at the right where, and I don't know why there wasn't ignition on the right-hand side. If the block stays together, then the community generally stays together. But if you lose one building where there's greater density, you really can see that interaction effect. So these are whole homes. And I know a lot of the way that, the towns and communities in and around Inyo and Mono are constructed, there's often a little more space between the buildings. But just, to kind of get a visual on this kind of separation distance and how that has some interaction effect. So what I want to do is really talk about pathways and transitions, and I'm going to move into LA and some of the things that we've seen from LA. But this graphic, I know it's clip art, I think it's trying to help articulate what I'm seeing. So if we start on the right-hand side, typically we get wildfire that ignites, from a chain that someone's dragging on the road, or sometimes we see power lines come down or a cigarette being thrown out the window, and we get fire coming from somewhere else. And that fire moves through the vegetation and eventually gets closer to our communities or to our homes. And it transitions from this wildland vegetation into the cultivated landscape. And then it often interacts with other fuels. I'm going to illustrate this with a fence. And then that other fuels or vegetation carries the fire directly to the structure. And so where you have that direct wick creates a problem, because all of a sudden we've got a pathway for fire to run at the structure. Simultaneously, we can have wind picking up embers and picking up debris, and those get moved long distance, and they move more deeply into our built communities, and they find pathways into our buildings, and they find receptive fuels, as in our landscaped materials all around our buildings, and all of a sudden you've got spot fires that are deep within the community. So here's showing kind of a linear progression, and then once you get a variety of things happening, you can also have multiple points of contact. So here I'm showing, again, you can have vegetation or fence running to the house coming from different directions, and there's kind of multiple pathways happening. So what we often talk about, is the importance of home hardening so that you don't get ignition from embers, the importance of fuel modification so that maybe you can catch the fire out here, somewhere farther away from the community. Though when you have wind, the equation changes, because you need to create a way to prevent this ignition from embers in the areas closest to our homes and of the things that might wick fire, like this fence to our structure. So we have now, I think, a broader, more full set of options and issues that we need to pay attention to be able to kind of look more comprehensively at the wildfire exposure equation. And we've talked for years about fuel ladders, being this idea that fire can climb up the ladders of the branches of the trees or of the shrubs to the trees, and you get this stair step climbing where then you end up with fire in this case in a forested setting. I'd like to bring that same concept to our built environment, where essentially our vegetation and our trellises and our gates and our fences act as these rungs on the ladder, which then bring fire to the buildings. All right, so you with me? So using that kind of framework, I'd like to just give you some sense of what I saw in LA. Very urban environment, very different densities. I saw homes survived the high elevation levels just coming out of the mountains in Altadena. I saw them in Palisades. I saw them on the beach, all over, so lots of different environments. Most everybody has some type of fence or some kind of way to define their property and separate one building from the other. And what I observed are situations like this, where this house had a property fence that gave it privacy and security. Fire could come down the edge of the fence, and then when the fence turned towards the property, towards the house, towards creating some security there, fire could run directly at the house. In this case, the house survives because of firefighter intervention, which basically cuts this gate off and keeps fire from touching the house. So from a best practice perspective, what we're talking about is trying to get people to replace that attachment. So just replacing this piece so that fire doesn't transmit directly to the structure. I mean, it's a bummer to lose the rest of the fence, but the fence is much more repairable and replaceable than it is the whole house. So cutting off that pathway is what we're talking about. Here's a couple other examples of vegetation that's very close to structures. One is of stucco, one is of wood construction. These are both older. I can guarantee you that there was firefighter response that prevented further progression of fire in both of these situations. Vegetation and structures rarely self-extinguish, so you usually need someone's helping hand to do that, and I was on the ground to confirm that. So here's an example of this cement walkway They left about a foot available to kind of soften the edge. There's some irises planted. And then there's this woody shrub here. And that woody shrub is kind of oversized, I'd say, and maybe grown beyond what you might want to see because it's smashed up against the under eave area. It is dropping debris, and embers basically ignited the base of that. And without a helping hand, I can guarantee you that this building would have been lost. Single pane windows in this section down here. So very vulnerable wood siding. In this case, a hedge, and then some junipers, and then here's one of those really dense decorative conifers, and we had ignition in all of those, and they were sending off flames, which caused damage to the fascia and the under eave area, and without fire suppression, we would have lost that structure. So combustibles right next to the house, things that we use to kind of soften and beautify, are creating vulnerability. All right, so I've got a couple of videos that I'd like to show to illustrate these. These are taken with my cell phone, and I think there should be enough audio.
Walking down this pathway between the two buildings, you can see that the trees got involved, and the trees led to a lot of heat exposure onto these windows. Here's where the window pane is on its way out because the glazing has melted, and you can see the breakage up there. These look to be annealed glass. I don't see the tempered glass bead, and you can tell by the way that the window is cracking. And then over here, the gate engaged.
I don't know if you were able to hear that well enough. Crystal, was that loud enough?
Yes, I thought that it sounded fine.
Okay, so notice this shovel here. Someone came and propped that gate open and left it open. The house adjacent was fully lost. The point being, you get this massive amount of radiant heat that's coming off the adjacent house, and you can see how much pressure it's putting on the property that I was walking around. And while we saw some window pane crackage, unfortunately, none of them failed, but you can see it was right on the edge because the window glazing was deforming, and that allowed the panels to begin to slip. So if the heat had persisted, we would have seen the rest of those panels continue to fall to the ground.
And walking it.
So here's another example.
I'm going to flip it around a bit so that we can get some wider view on what this looks like, where we're at this interesting place where we've got some damaged and some lost structures. Mountain view behind us, and we can see the damage on the stucco siding. And there actually isn't a lot of fascia damage, to my surprise. What we've been seeing in this fire is that the stucco construction helps hold in the heat as the building burns, and then it later collapses, which is likely what is slowing some of the heat damage on the adjacent building. But walking down this way, you can see that this gate was really critical in not wicking the fire to the building, where here is the remnants of the wooden fence that was separating the two properties.
So I know that's a little quiet here, but this is a whole fence line, sits on top of a little cinder block, and we lose the whole fence. We lose the house to the left, but the house on the right holds together. So pretty impressive. And just that gate separation is what made the difference in survivorship and loss in this particular situation. This one, I believe I don't have audio of. So this is Upper Altadena. The fire moves through this kind of open space area. You can see the connection potential through that fence. Look at the big use of patios all around here. You can start to see some of the ember wash here. They've got a metal gate. There's this block wall here, and that block wall holds a lot of radiant heat. There's some ash there. Here again is a metal gate, which is fantastic. So if you get ignition, it doesn't move from one side to the other. But when you look over the wall, look at what happened just over here. So lots of heat damage coming from that direction, but the block wall really helped keep some of that heat damage away. Now, this house is almost perfect, but then when we get to the front, you can see that there was some combustible mulch, and we lose the garden reel. We lose some stuff along in this section here. That's where the water shutoffs are and that plastic in there. And we burn off a bunch of this trailing shrub that is planted over these block walls, really common. So, block wall, great, but then if you cover it in combustible stuff, that less great. And then you can see how the palm tree, how it was able to burn off the kind of edge of where the fronds are removed. My point is I'm just trying to show you different examples of what combustibility looks like. And then I want to show a little bit more about connected fuels. This is from 2022 in Texas. There's a wildfire that's ignited following the road. It's going to run at this community. We've kind of compressed the video. It takes place over about 15 minutes, but I only have about a minute here to show you. Grassland fire, and it's running right at this very suburban community, and it runs immediately into a fence. Here's a shed. I want you to pay attention to this shed to see how long it lasts. We've got the fire running down the property line, and we've got flames heading directly to the primary building. And pretty soon we start to see the full shed ignited, and then fire is coming in multiple pathways at this community. Eventually, we're going to get the inside of this building ignited, because we're going to start to see smoke coming out of the vents inside the attic. And that you can see what's happening here of how that attic is ignited. So thinking about pathways is what I'm trying to put you into, that kind of detective mode, and recognizing that fuels can be wood and organic based, but they also can be petroleum and petroleum based products. So vinyl is going to burn just as much as wood decking will, for example, or wood fences. So over the years, I've talked a lot about home hardening and kind of understanding those predictable locations within structures. And I'm just going to highlight a few of these. I know Crystal's got great resources. Kristen has great resources to take a deeper dive into all this stuff. But we touch on these issues of complex roofs, where you have either roof to wall intersections, or in this case, a dormer. And the roofing can handle the flame exposure on the top surface, but the siding itself can't. So how do we harden these more complex roofs and do that in a retrofit way? Or if we design and build new with a complex roof, how to make sure that each of these components have that same hardening capacity to the best of our ability. We've talked about fence to houses. You can imagine where especially those of you that are in Mammoth Lakes, the function of rain gutters maybe are compromised by snow, but they're great collection points for debris, and you can get ignition in those gutters. And then you've got the roof edge that's exposed to ignition right adjacent to it. And then I've been talking a little bit about vents, so let's just cover them for a second. Vents have screening on them, and there's a circulation system that every building has. That circulation system lets cool air in and allows convection, and then you get the hot and moist air out, which is key to preventing dry rot within the house itself. But because we use vent screen size that's pretty large, which is designed to keep rodents out, embers can enter and come on the inside. And so this is an image on the inside of a building showing how the embers are swirling around and entering via these little vents along the side. So in California, we now have a new building code for construction in the wildland urban interface. And so there are materials that have been tested. And so there's more guidance and more standards for new construction. The question is, how do we retrofit existing buildings, and how do we help those most vulnerable? So I just want to applaud all of you for your interest in this topic and thinking about this in more detail. So where do you start? It's a complex topic, and I won't go on in detail, but I think every building in California needs a good roof. I think we can all probably recognize that the roof is what's keeping all the stuff away, whether that be the snow, the rain, the hail. And it shoulders a huge responsibility. It's a big, wide, horizontal surface, captures a lot of stuff. So the roof needs to be in good shape. Everybody's vents need to be upgraded, and there's some do-it-yourself versions, and there's some new vents. We'll talk about those in a minute. And then everybody needs 5 feet of clearance around their structure without combustibles in that. And that includes a whole lot of things, and I'll describe those in a minute. When buildings are on steep slopes or when neighborhoods are denser, then we can see some other issues come about. I talked about 50 feet earlier, but I just really want to dial into maybe like 30 feet. So where you've got buildings that are within 30 feet separation of each other, the potential for radiant heat increases substantially. And that's where we see that window issue that I showed you in that video. That's where you can also see combustible siding becoming more vulnerable. And so where building density increases, if you can't separate the buildings, then you need to harden more on those two planes where the buildings interact. If it's a shed, maybe you can push it away, move it a little farther away. But if it's your detached garage or your neighbor's house, then it becomes more complex. And so just, develop a home hardening strategy to shore up that side of the structure that is got the potential for radiant heat damage. So 2025 is the year to upgrade vents and to implement this new defensible space zone, which we're calling Zone 0. It's 0 to 5 feet working from the house out. And, you can see that we've got vegetation in that zone. We've got vents of a big mesh size. So both of these things would be great to start to address. Maybe you start on one side of the house and work your way around. There's lots of different approaches on how to do this, and there's stuff that you can do that's low cost and more easily accomplishable. So we've talked just briefly about vents. Most of us have a mesh screen size of 1/4 inch in size. And what I'd like you to think about is if you could cut that down to 1/8, not farther than that, but 1/8, so that when ember exposure occurs, you might have a little tiny bit that goes through. It's not going to extinguish anything. It's not going to ignite anything because the ember is so small that it won't have much heat in it. So you can add another layer of mesh screening to your existing vents. You can do that with some wire snips to cut the metal mesh, and then a staple gun to add it. Can be done on the inside, can be done on the outside. And I saw a couple examples in LA where people had done that on their freeze block vents. And I'm going to give them a big star and a point for making a difference. There's a class of new vents that resist both flames and embers, and they're super cool. And I think some of you, I can't remember if Crystal and Kristen, if you have them in your materials kit. There's lots of cool things to check out. If you're building new, I definitely recommend building with these vents. And if you've got an area where you're always going to have a flame contact issue because you can't move something, then having one of these vents that it's harder for flames to get inside is really recommended. And they come in lots of configurations, and they are retrofittable into almost every situation that you might have. Just need to order them if you don't have them available in your store. So in wrapping up here, there are a number of places on a structure to be paying attention to, and we can follow up with some of these ideas and some of the materials that we send out. But it's a whole comprehensive view. It's not only materials, it's really their installation and the maintenance that all come together to create that hardened exterior structure, and then that reduced fuel zone immediately around your property. So I'll wrap up and then pause for questions here around kind of building and rebuilding. So if any of you have someone or yourself, and you're thinking about building or you need to rebuild, a couple things to keep in mind. The simpler the roof line, the better, because then you don't have those roof to wall intersections, and you've got a roof that's really going to shoulder and be the most robust. This idea of the first 5 feet being important, we call it Zone 0, so much easier to incorporate from the very beginning. And I think there's huge opportunity to do it in a very elegant and beautiful way, where you're still going to have landscaping, you're still going to have color spots, you're still going to have beauty. It's just a little bit farther away from the house. And if you're choosing a site and where you're going to locate a house, this perched house on a slope, super cool views, totally get that. But fire tends to flow uphill, and you get preheating as a result of that. And so you get a lot of extra drying on the edge of the house and the deck. So the better approach is to give some setback and push back the house from the edge of the slope. And as I mentioned before, there are a lot of good information in California's Chapter 7A standards of the California Building Code that can help give some guidance around materials to choose from and some bigger thoughts around some of the challenges that we're talking about here. So I'm at 6:22. I think I've talked maybe a little too long, and maybe we should go to some questions if you've got any. And I'll stop sharing and look forward to answering as much as we can tonight. You've got them.
Yeah, feel free to add your questions to the chat and I can relay them to Yana, or if you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question directly, you may. There's a question in the chat, suggested material for decks.
Yeah, oh, I just took my deck slides down. So you know what, I'm gonna share again because I think that is very cool stuff to look at. Decks are really interesting. I love decks. I'm just gonna say I'm a big fan of decks. And I'm just gonna do this in this way here. There's some thought that I want you to put into deck installation if you're gonna build a new deck. First, thinking about how you're gonna manage the underside of a deck and keep the weeds down and keep the debris out. When the decks are not very tall, screening around the deck is really a great practice. But additionally, thinking about how the deck attaches to the structure. So most of us have boards running parallel to the structure. Adding a metal flashing component around the ledger board is really helpful because if you do get ignition in the deck, you've got a way to kind of stop that progression primarily to the structure. Additionally, there's been some great work done at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety with this idea that if you add metal flashing or bitumen tape to the top of the deck joists, if you get ignition in those joists, and that's generally where we tend to see ignition is from the underside on the deck joist, but sometimes it comes from the top, it can kind of slow that spread and progression towards the building. So a piece of metal flashing, not very expensive, or this metal bitumen tape, not very expensive, are some other ways to get at this issue. And here's just an illustration of how you might enclose the underside of a deck when the deck is low. If the deck's tall and high off the ground, then really it's just about keeping it clear and keeping the debris out from underneath it and not storing it. And if your house is such that it's possible to put some kind of patio or do something differently, by all means, use that approach. But in all cases, there really isn't a non-combustible deck board. There are a variety of different choices, and even the composite ones are flammable in their own way.
Next question is, I noticed in our new well-insulated home that the doors are so tight that they sometimes don't close all the way, later blowing open in high wind. This could cause problems after evacuation. Could you speak to evacuation checklists that homeowners can do before leaving?
Yeah, that's a really terrific question. I think you're identifying, this is a weak issue in your house. And I certainly have known a door that doesn't like to close and doesn't like to latch. And I highly recommend that you write down a checklist, because in the moment of panic when you're trying to leave, I forget things. So that checklist is really important. And we have some on our University of California Fire website. Crystal and Kristen, you might have some. But there are different things to do at different time intervals. And so if you've got the luxury of time of you anticipate a fire might lead towards an evacuation, what you do 6 hours before that evacuation might be very different if you only have 6 minutes. And so, I'll just kind of hint at the things that you should do when you've got more time. And that is like, shut your propane tank off for your barbecue and move it away from the property, or move it inside the garage. Throw the doormats away from the house. Move the combustible furniture either in or away from the deck, so that you don't have something that's going to ignite on the deck. Stage buckets of water. So if someone comes by, they can throw some of that water if you've got a little spot fire. Leave a ladder up. Close every vent and everything down that you possibly can. And, then there's, of course, all the things you need to have in your go bag and the stuff that you're going to need for your family and the video that you need to create that you've walked through the house and recorded some of your basic items so that if you have an insurance loss, you have more ability to demonstrate what you had in your house. There's a line of thinking to work on there. And the other thing I'll say is if you haven't gotten to the vent issue yet and you still have those wide open vents, having a system to be able to shut them down temporarily is really recommended. And, I am totally for all the DIY approaches. Like you could cut, and this is, you might as well put the extra screen up than cut some kind of block to close off the vents. But even some tinfoil and some things that are of kind of quick and dirty, you can shut some of those vents off by doing that. I also keep some metal bitumen tape around. I have a cabin that I have defend itself, and I seal up the edge of my door, which doesn't fit perfectly, to keep those embers out when they hit in the door. So the metal bitumen tape, is basically metal tape that's got adhesive on it, and you can kind of close off some of those weak points at the last minute.
Awesome.
Okay, so the next question, are all trees created equal in posing fire risk? To some degree, yes. All trees drop debris, all trees provide shade if they're healthy. All trees, present some challenge one way or another. There is no materials, there is no plant list that's perfect in any setting. I live with some Mexican madrone trees, maybe not going to translate to your communities. Very messy trees. They drop so much stuff, and it's just this kind of constant agony I have in my patio trying to keep it clean. So, I would just encourage you to think about whether you can maintain that tree and whether you can hydrate that tree properly and take out all of the dead or declining branches and clean up those ladder fuels so that fire doesn't climb up into the upper portions of those canopies. And, just think about what it means to be the steward of that tree to the best of your ability. If you planted a tree recently, it's in the first 5 feet, maybe it's time to move that tree before it gets too big, because the new defensible space regulations associated with Zone 0, small trees in that first 5 feet are going to be recommended for removal. Larger trees, as long as you've managed the ladder fuels and kept the branches above the roof and away from the chimney, then those will be acceptable.
Another one come in for tall trees is the 50-foot measured from the trunk or from the place that the top might land when it falls.
Is that a local reference to some type of ordinance related to 50 feet?
I'm unsure about that.
Well, I think I might need a little more detail.
I think maybe she's referencing the radiant heat number that you described of 50 feet. Is that that's kind of what I'm thinking.
Yeah. Okay. So
I'm thinking it's a typo, that it's really the 5 feet and that the 0 doesn't belong there.
Okay, let's break that down for a second. Can you think of Italian cypress? They're these long, skinny things that are they're
Roman candles.
Yeah, they're coniferous, and they senesce dead debris into them and they hold onto them. If you have a row of Italian cypress right at 5 feet and those ignite, you're going to have a massive radiant heat load. As we said, the Roman candle example adjacent to the structure. So not the most ideal tree to have in that location. If you have, I don't know, a Jeffrey pine, and you're able to prune those lower branches, you're not going to have a tree that has as much ability for fire to climb up into the upper canopies. If you have a cherry tree, you're not going to have that same ability. So removing those lower branches prevents fire from climbing up into those upper portions. But you do need to create some separation so that if there are big branches, they're not rubbing on the house, they're not rubbing on the roof, and causing some abrasion and otherwise damage. all trees are going to drop debris, and wind is going to move that debris around, even from farther distance, even if the tree is 30 feet away. So, having trees close by just means you're in the maintenance game. And, just being aware that you're part of its maintenance for your property in general is, I think, what I'm encouraging you to think about.
Okay, great. I don't see any more questions in the chat right now, and we are at 6:30. So if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out. Let's see, I'll put my contact in the chat real quick here. But just wanted to mention again that this Saturday in June Lake, we're going to be talking about this exact stuff, home hardening and defensible space, and we actually get to go and walk to a demonstration home. So we'll be able to really have a hands-on experience and walk around a property to see, what this property could do, what you can do, and ask more questions. That will be with Beth Burnham, Saturday at 11 a.m. at June Lake Community Center. So please do join us. It's not for just June Lake residents. Anybody's welcome to join. Thank you all. Wildfire resilience really is a community effort. So thank you all for being here and doing your part. We appreciate you and hope you will join us for more events throughout the month. Thank you, Yana.
Thank you, Yana. Thank you all for coming. And we hope to see you in June Lake. This is Wendy.
Hi, Wendy.
Hi.
Hi, Beth.
Hi.
Hi, friends.
Thank you all for coming. Hi, Heidi. Hi, everybody. Hi, Steve. Okay.
Hope I see everybody in June Lake.
Yeah, June will be fun. A good place for you guys to do the hands-on and really learn what everything looks like. And we'll feed you as well.
Yes.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Good night, everyone.